It was just past 1 a.m. when the Banqiao Dam succumbed to the relentless pressure of its swollen reservoir. The failure began with cracks forming in the structure, which quickly widened as the immense force of the water overwhelmed the dam's defenses. Within moments, the concrete and earthwork barrier gave way, unleashing a torrent that had been building up for days. The release of water was explosive and violent, creating a wave of unimaginable force and size. The floodwater surged forward with a volume estimated at 700 million cubic meters in the first 6 hours, enough water to fill nearly 280,000 Olympic-sized swimming pools. The initial wall of water was reported to be 10 kilometers wide and 6 meters or 20 feet high, moving at a speed of up to 50 kilometers per hour or 30 miles per hour. In the pitch-black darkness, the flood hit downstream villages and towns with no warning. Many residents were asleep and had no chance to escape. Homes were obliterated within seconds as the water swept through the flat plains. Entire families were washed away, with barely a moment to react. Trees, buildings, and infrastructure were uprooted and carried by the current, turning the flood into a battering ram of debris. The devastation extended far beyond the immediate vicinity of the Banqiao Dam. The floodwaters surged downstream, breaking through other dams and causing a cascading failure of 62 additional dams. This chain reaction compounded the disaster, turning it into a regional catastrophe. The immediate death toll from drowning was staggering. Estimates suggest that 26,000 people died in the initial flood wave. Many more succumbed in the days and weeks that followed. Survivors faced nightmarish conditions, stranded on rooftops, clinging to debris, or trapped in waterlogged areas with no food, clean water, or medical care. The flood submerged an area of 12,000 square kilometers, 4,600 square miles, larger than the state of Connecticut. Crops were destroyed, and nearly 6 million buildings were flattened or severely damaged. Entire villages and towns were wiped off the map, their residents either dead or displaced. The aftermath was equally grim. An estimated 145,000 people died from secondary causes, including starvation, exposure, and waterborne diseases such as dysentery. The flood had destroyed critical infrastructure, including roads, bridges, and communication lines, making it nearly impossible for relief efforts to reach those in need. Survivors, isolated and desperate, were left to fend for themselves in a landscape that resembled a war zone. Survivor accounts paint a vivid and haunting picture of that fateful night. Some described hearing a deafening roar as the dam collapsed, followed by the sound of the floodwaters tearing through their villages. In some areas, the flood struck so suddenly that people had no time even to climb trees or rooftops for safety. One survivor recalled, "The water came like a black wall in the night. It swallowed everything. Houses disappeared like paper, people were screaming, but the water was too fast." Others who managed to find higher ground were stranded for days without food or clean water. They watched helplessly as the floodwaters carried away their homes, livestock, and loved ones. Survivors described the sky turning grey from the haze of destruction, with the stench of decaying bodies and stagnant water filling the air. The flood permanently altered the landscape of Henan Province. Rivers changed course, farmlands were rendered infertile by silt and debris, and entire ecosystems were disrupted. Livestock populations were decimated and forests were flattened, leaving the region vulnerable to further erosion and environmental degradation. The destruction of agricultural fields compounded the tragedy as it led to famine in the months that followed. Survivors were left without a means of sustenance, relying on sparse government aid that often arrived too late. The Banqiao Dam disaster caused widespread displacement, leaving over 11 million people homeless. The ripple effects of the flood were felt for years as communities struggled to rebuild in the face of overwhelming loss. Families were torn apart, with many survivors never finding the bodies of their loved ones. The economic toll was also immense. Entire towns had to be rebuilt, and the damage to agriculture and industry crippled the region's economy for years. The disaster set back development efforts in Henan Province, underscoring the far-reaching consequences of such a calamity. Despite the scale of the disaster, news of the Banqiao Dam collapse remained suppressed for decades. Survivors were discouraged from speaking out, and journalists were barred from investigating. The Chinese government downplayed the event, labeling it as a natural disaster.